Bring it on. Try to confuse me.
What a marvelous remarks you've made tonight.
Thank you.
I think you've moved everybody.
Thank you.
I'm curious, what brought you from the University of Virginia to China? And then what brought you back? Because you said you were thinking about staying 10 more years.
Okay, all right, so here we are, I'm coming back. I'm glad you asked it because I felt called by God twice in my life where it's just really clear the Lord is calling you to do something. And, I've had people and friends and lots of college students who ask about, should I do this job or that job? And usually I'm like, pray, ask other people's advice, and then go make a decision. You just got to make a decision. But 2 times in my life, I actually felt called by the Lord to do something. The first was to go to China. And a little insight into my life. I was an English major in college. Never thought I was going to become a lawyer. I was actually debating going to tour with my rock band or go to China as a missionary. I wasn't sure which. The Lord spoke clearly into that chaos. It was my dad began his career as a missionary. He was also a lawyer who then got into politics. And I always, ever since I started following Jesus, I had always thought, oh, that's a neat way to do something after college. So it was on my radar because my dad had done it, and I started praying, and I really felt the Lord calling me to go be a missionary to China. What was more interesting is what happened on the way back. So the slightly expanded version of that story is that I lived in China for almost 4 years at this time. I walked to the center of Shanghai. It's kind of like Times Square, but meets Las Vegas, just tons of blinking lights. This place of Shanghai is like East meets West, capitalism meets communism, foreigner meets native Chinese. It's a wild place. I had been there a ton of times, but I had never before seen a political protester. There's the one time in China I saw a political protest. And what happened was I had just passed a black market thief who I knew because he opened his jacket and was like, would you like to, there was a laptop-sized pocket sewn into his jacket. I kid you not. And he was like, would you like to buy a laptop for $10? And I'm like, laptops don't cost $10. I'm not doing that. And I was walking down the street and I saw this old lady unfurl a banner. And I was like, she seems like whatever she's doing on purpose. I want to look at that. And she was clearly from the countryside. She was clearly had been malnourished as a child because she was just very small, very stooped. And as she unfurled the banner, I start to read. I read Chinese at the time. I'm very rusty now. But I read slowly. So within 60 seconds, I had probably gotten just through the words, the judicial system in China is broken. The people in the countryside are being oppressed. That was as far as I got. Because within 60 seconds, there's a crowd of hundreds of people already gathered around me. Keep in mind, this is like Times Square kind of population. And there's already police sirens going off because there's already a motorcycle cop circling it. But I'm at the front, like right next to her. So in China, it's a thing called renao, where if there's something going on in the street, even a crime, everybody just crowds around and watches. It's like the opposite of the American thing, like put up the yellow tape, everybody get away. No, everybody's like, let's go in and see what's going on. So I'm at the front, I got a front row seat, and the cop comes up, and he looks at the lady, and he says, you know you're not allowed to do this. And I'll never forget, she looked back at him and she said, but you know this is true. I was like, oh, look at this. And then he goes, and you know what's going to happen now. And I remember, all right, so there was like one rule to being a missionary in China. Maybe 2. Share your faith with the Chinese people. Rule number 2, don't get involved in political protesting. Don't do it. Quickest way to get sent home. So here I am, the classic American, and I interrupt. I actually say to the cop, I say, excuse me, sir, excuse me. Again, this is not totally weird in China. It's not totally weird. It was weird because I was a white guy speaking Chinese to the cop. But it wasn't weird to talk to the cop. So I said, do you know, I could show you a thief. I just passed one. A guy just stolen a laptop. I saw it over here. Would you like to arrest him? And he looks at me and just waves his hand like this, which is a Chinese gesture for shut up. And so I do. And within a minute, she's in a police van and gone. And I remember walking, and I hear this voice behind me say, psst, hey. I turn around, It's a Chinese teenager from the countryside. Actually, he was a Uyghur. You hear about the Uyghurs? I could really get into like all the politics of this story. It was a Uyghur sort of immigrant to Shanghai who was selling drugs, because that's what the Uyghurs do in Shanghai, because the Chinese government lets them do that to earn a living, because otherwise they're worried that they will create problems and protests and stuff. So anyway, there's a reason that the drug dealers are all Uyghurs. And he says, would you like to buy some marijuana? And I wave my hand at him, because I'm like, I don't want drugs. And as I'm walking away from this, I'm looking at the 5 or 6 brothels that I'll pass on the way out of here. And so this whole long story is because it was this moment, I had a watershed moment where I just passed 4 illegal things in China. All right? Dealing, prostituting, stealing, and protesting. They're all illegal in China. But 3 of them will make you good money, and the cops will generally turn their head the other way. One of them, which I would consider the only brave act of love for neighbor, will get you immediately arrested. And it was the kind of moment for me where I felt like this top-down pressure all of a sudden, where I was like, oh my gosh, the ways that we set up our politics and our economics matter to the average person, and whether they even have a plausibility structure of following God or not. Because I had come to China on the idea that I would share the gospel with somebody, they would share the gospel with somebody else, and we'd have this like horizontal movement. And I completely believe in that still, and I could support missionaries in China still. But to me, that was a moment where I also saw the top-down nature of missional influence, that the way you set up systems matters. And I just felt personally, as I reflected on this moment, I was like, I want in on that. That's the kind of missional work. If I can be in on changing systems so that they're more redemptive instead of more chaotic, I was just really compelled by that. Probably no surprise that in some way now I still think in those terms, systems of habit. I still think of what's going on under the hood that's shaping our lives in ways that we don't realize. And I think about that in systems of politics and economics as a lawyer. My dad was in politics, so I think about that a lot. And I feel like it's a call that I have. So long answer to the question you asked, but that's what I meant when I said I felt called to come home from China. Thanks for making me share that. I did want to.
I wondered if you could unpack a little more about having an hourly conversation once a week.
Yeah.
The vulnerable.
Yeah. So practically speaking, what this looks like for me is having a constant rhythm with Matt and Steve where we get together. And I talk in habits because habits are elastic. And when you set rhythms, it's like a wagon wheel rut. I mean, it's really, once you're in the rut, it's really easy to keep going. It's really hard to get out of it. And when Matt and Steve and I are in the rut of getting together and talking and just being friends, we've over the years cultivated just a natural vulnerability with each other. But you have to dig that rut, right? And so what I talk about with people is finding a weekly touch point. Again, this might be a true accountability partner, or it might be just a small group. It might be your close friend that you call or Zoom with. Though I'm a big fan of embodied conversation because I think the possibilities are just way, way more significant. But vulnerability, I think, is what you're really asking about, and that's the really important part. To me, it means disclosing the things that I am just typically afraid that people will know. All right, so this could be anything from the first time I told Matt and Steve is like, the anxiety is getting so bad that I either have to take sleeping pills or drink 2 or 3 glasses of wine. That's really embarrassing. I wasn't a raging alcoholic, but I was a medicating lawyer. It's different to say to a friend like, I'm stressed right now. Work is really getting to me. That's how we usually talk. And they're like, I'll pray for you. To say, I'm so nervous that I can't sleep without a couple glasses of wine, that's vulnerability. That's coming out from behind the shield. To say, I'm struggling in my marriage right now, that's important. But to say, I've got a pornography habit, that's vulnerability. Or to say, I'm starting to flirt with this person in the workplace, that's vulnerability. To say, like, I'm anxious about my parenting. it's making me nervous. That's important, but to say I keep having this recurring fear that my child will do X or become X. Like, we're all afraid of if somebody actually saw what's going on in the inner life of our mind. We're all afraid if somebody actually saw what's going on in the inner life of our rooms or bedrooms or living rooms or internet history. And I think that one of the greatest things that we can do is actually just turn it inside out and find somebody to share it with. I just finished rereading Life Together by Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Some of you have probably heard of it. Many of you have probably read it. I hadn't read it since college. I went back and reread it recently. I was just blown away. But I was like, was I even awake reading it the first time? It's one of those books you read and it's all new the second time. And he has the final closing chapter on confession and communion. And it hit me because this is the kind of thing that I talk about all the time. And I was like, oh man, people have been talking, none of this is new, right? Bonhoeffer in that chapter just talks about the spiritual discipline of confessing to someone else your sin. And he talks about, how the psalmist talks about when my sin was hidden, it burned my bones, but when I confessed. And he talks about the value of what he said that I thought was really remarkable is lots of times when we confess to God in our heads silently, lots of times I think we're convincing, his words, not mine, we're convincing ourselves that we're confessing more than we actually are. There's something hidden about it still because we haven't said it out loud. And so he just encourages the practice of actually naming the sin out loud. And when I talk about vulnerability, that's really what I mean. My life has been changed by people who have been vulnerable to me. And suddenly I realized, it's okay that we talk about that? It's okay that we share, because actually, I've been dying, A lot of people ask how to do it, and I just say, just start. Now, you probably want to be responsible and pick somebody who really will hold your confidence and trust. But it's a really powerful thing just to start being vulnerable with somebody. Usually vulnerability breeds vulnerability. I don't think there's an age limit to this. I don't think there's a difference. I think sometimes it's harder for men to share than women, not necessarily, but harder. But I think across genders, across ages, across cultures, the idea that saying to somebody, I will tell you my secrets, you know what happens? Friendship happens. Friendship happens when you start to share your secrets. Think about your high school best friend or your college roommate. This is what happens. So as a practice, doing that kind of vulnerability is what creates the kind of thick friendships that I think create the pillars of community. And I'll stop there because I could just go on. But come up afterwards if you have more on that. You've been waiting so patiently.
I can't believe how wise you're going to be when you're our age.
Yeah, right. You talk to my wife. She'll tell you all my foibles and flaws, too.
When you were sitting with your friends or when you were at that low point, and did you have a bolt of lightning or an epiphany, or was it gradual? And then did you ever reach a point where, is this going to take?
Yeah, great questions. Very practical, too. No, it was not a bolt of lightning. Two things happened. I remember a couple months after that meeting, I saw a friend at a wedding who knew what I had been struggling with. And he was like, how are you? He said, how are you doing in the way that he means it? Like, how are you doing? And I remember saying, I'm doing really good. And it was the first time since my whole crisis collapse where I had answered the question. I was like, I actually am doing good. And that was my first small lightning bolt where I realized, why am I doing so much better now? And I started to think about maybe this habit stuff is taking more than I thought. That's when I started paying attention. And as I continued to practice these habits, naturally, as the kind of maybe lawyer and amateur theologian that I am, I just started to read about it and think about it more. So I started to buy books on cultural liturgies or the habits, the idea that normal things that we do, because theologians are writing about the power of liturgy. There's one in particular named Jamie Smith, who's written more upstream work about what he calls cultural liturgies, cultural norms form us spiritually more than we think. I started reading. So that really helped me start to name the things that I would experience, because I would not have said then that I had been shepherded into an anxiety crisis by habit. I really didn't know what had happened then. It was as the Lord walked me out of this. It's like you walk out of you don't see the valley until you walk out of the valley. You know what I mean? Like, and then as the Lord, walked me out of the valley of shadow of death, I looked back, I was like, oh my gosh, I see the slope I fell down to get that, right? And that's why I keep using metaphors like currents and slopes and tilts. I mean, American life is tilted, right? We're talking about friendship and vulnerability. Like the slant of American life is to become busier, wealthier people who used to have friends. Not supposed to be funny, but I'm glad you guys take it lightly. We need to work against that slant, right, to get out of it. And so as the Lord started to work in my life, I started to see that habit had led me into this. And that's one of the important insights. I don't think that you can think yourself out of a problem you didn't think yourself into. If you practice your way into a problem, you got to practice your way out. Like, a smoker or an alcoholic or a drug addict, they're not going to think themselves out of the addiction. It's a practice thing. You got to practice your way out. You got to start. Thinking matters, don't get me wrong. Like, your head matters. Absolutely. It's just, you're not just a head. You're also a body. You're a full being. And so there's a larger thing that you have to do. And I would just say it's a combination of your head and your heart working together through habit. And so the question about did it stick or just did it take, that's a very practical one of actually, psychologists will tell you it takes about 4 to 6 weeks to form a new habit. It's generally true. It's important to know all of the stuff I talked about is going to be weird until it isn't. It's always weird to do scripture before phone. It's always weird to start sharing with a friend consistently. It's always weird a Sabbath will interrupt your usual rhythms. You have to, community is the best way to do it, right? Nobody changes well alone. But if you have one accountability partner or one community group or ministry team who's going to say, hey, over the course of the next 6 weeks, let's ask each other about this. An amazing thing will happen. You will fail along the way. Not about perfection. Faithfulness is way, way more important. But somewhere along the way, you'll let's say it's scripture before phone. Some way along the way, you'll get up and you won't think about your phone for the first time in forever. Or maybe it's like an hour with no news in the evening. There'll be some evening after dinner where for weeks, it's like, oh, I want to turn on the news. But I said I wouldn't do that for this hour. And then some evening, you'll just go on a walk and you won't even think about it. And that's habit. Habit is kicked in. It's in your lower brain, which is amazing. Why? Because now you can add more. Habits are really light. Once they're internalized, you can always add another one. And this is what I think, everybody's heard of downward spirals, where just things keep getting worse. There's a virtuous cycle to habits where you can really start adding things now because you're not thinking about scripture before phone anymore, so now I'm going to add a prayer rhythm. And then you're not thinking about that anymore, so you're going to add a communal meal rhythm. And suddenly, you're living like a monastic in the sense that you're actually intentional about your spiritual life, but you're still a corporate lawyer, doing all the things that corporate lawyers are supposed to do. And sometimes people are like, how do you do all that stuff? I'm like, I don't think about it. It's not hard. You do all this stuff too. We just pick different habits. So the whole battle is just choosing, expect it to take a couple weeks, but then expect it to drop under the radar. And that's the wonderful thing. Did I see a hand go up in the back? Or?
Yes, but you answered my question.
Okay, all right. Then we'll go with this microphone, and then I saw your hand, so we could do. And then I see somebody moving in the back. We got time for those, I think. Baxter, do we?
One of the things you mentioned a while ago, you were talking about loneliness. Mm-hmm. And we're a very big country, but we're a very lonely country.
Yes.
With all the people that we have around.
Yes.
Especially for the last 2 years has emphasized the loneliness.
Yes.
Has exacerbated
Right.
all the problems. But also, I was a wife for 43 and a half years, mm-hmm. and now I'm not. Mm. My best friend is gone. My traveling buddy, my handyman, all those kinds of things. Mm-hmm. And you're in a very weird place when that happens. At different ages, different things happen to people that put you in an odd place. Mm-hmm. And you can be around a lot of people and still be very lonely. Mm-hmm. And it's hard to break out of that.
Yeah.
And you can go to things, but it's still hard not to be withdrawn inside. And so, I commend, talking about that because it's very real. No matter how old you are, how busy your family is, you can be in a family of 6 people and still be lonely.
Yes.
And so I think that's something that is important. And I was reading in our paper this morning, we had a young man in our community that chose to end his life this last weekend. And he was, not very old at all. And so there was something in his life that caused him desperation. And so it's not, nothing to do with age. It's, it's all around us.
I appreciate you sharing that. It's a strong point. This is why I like to use the word friendship rather than community. I got nothing against community. I love community. But I think it's, you can't mistake masses or people or attendance for real community. You can't necessarily, don't mistake community for real friendship. Just in the same way we were talking earlier with the ministry teams, talking about you can't mistake ministry for the love of God. The huge critique to the church of Ephesus we were mentioning was that you look great. You're doing all the things like excellently, A+. You've just forgotten the whole point of it. You've forgotten your first love. And that's a searing critique, like it's bad. But I think American churches, we actually just went through Revelation in our church, which seems to me from being with you all like we have a lot in common. And our pastor made the point, he's like, I think we'd probably be the most Ephesus-like church of all the churches that John names. I think a lot of churches are in danger of that. You do a lot, you just don't love the person who called you to do it anymore. And community can be like that. And sometimes it's not your fault, like you're saying. Sometimes your community drops off. Sometimes your community passes away. Sometimes your community is tragically taken. Sometimes it's for a good reason you left because you were called to China to be a missionary or something. Sometimes you're lonely for a holy reason. But I think in those situations, we don't mistake people in the room for friendship really occurring. And don't mistake ministry being done for the love of God and neighbor really happening. Fight for those things. They're not necessarily givens. I'll pause it there. You were supposed to be next, right?
I want to say thank you for coming in. I'm a new parishioner to the church. I'm a lot younger than many people in the room. I saw a lot of parallels in the life that you've led and the life that I want to lead. I also want to pursue law, and I want to get into politics, and I want to stay in Christianity. And togetherness can really mold the future for my generation. My generation is going to be replacing everyone eventually. The question I have for you, and I'd love to get more after this as well, is in a world of adversity towards organized religion and Christianity, how do you balance religion in your work life, and how do you deal with adverse clients?
Great. Okay, I love it. All right. One, the gentleman kindly said he sees a lot in me that he wants to do, including lawyering, maybe, politics. Just don't do the anxiety thing. Just leave that one. Good. Okay. The question was, and tell me if I get it right, in a world that's increasingly adverse to Christianity and faith, how do I deal with that, and particularly in clients too? Did I get it right? Okay. Two-part answer. First part more important. The first part is I actually take a lot of comfort in it. I want to let that sit for a minute. I take comfort in the adversity. I'm encouraged by it in a strange way. If you're living right now with your eyes open, if you're reading the news, it is pretty clear that it is getting weirder and weirder and potentially more and more dangerous, persecuted, odd, outcast to be a believer. That's bad, sort of. It also might not be that bad. Why? Because if you look at the church in the Bible and throughout history, wilderness and persecution is the norm. And it tends to make the church the church. And especially after coming from China, where I was surrounded by people who the most dangerous decision they made in their life was to follow Jesus. They knew. They didn't do it because everybody else was doing it. They didn't go to church because, that's what That's what all the insurance salesmen do. That's where you meet clients. No, that's where you lose your business. You go to church. You don't do that in China. And after experiencing the fire, nobody really knows the numbers, but the best estimates I saw was they have way more faithful Christians than America does, sheerly by the numbers. Granted, they're a lot bigger, but still, it's way more than you think in China, and they're way more sincere than you think. And they're willing to lose their life and speak up and not hide, and I think maybe we could use a dose of that. So don't get me wrong, for celebrating godlessness, and especially enforced godlessness, but I'm just not scared of that. I'm not worried about that. You won't find my hands getting wrung over that because I'm more thinking, oh, now the church gets to be the church. Now the church gets to actually say, do you follow Jesus when it's not good for your job? You follow Jesus when it's not good for your pocketbook? That's good stuff. I do not really think I could say that I've seen that adversity from clients. I think the upshot of that is that people take my faith, or sometimes most of my clients, not all of them know that I write and talk about stuff like this. Sometimes they'll find out on the internet, I didn't know you wrote a book. They're like, yeah, read it, Find out that my phone will be off an hour a day when you're trying to call. But mostly I hear people just say, yeah, I respect that. So I don't know if I'm unusual or not, but I don't generally find people being adverse. Even when it's like, oh, I'm not gonna, I can't do that on Sunday for you, but I'll pick it up on Monday morning. I've usually found people to say, oh, thank you for telling me, And you'll get good enough at your job where again, when a true emergency is a true emergency and it's worth interrupting your rhythms. I have those days. But I haven't found clients to be adverse.
I'm going to, because we have a covenant with everyone to end right around 7:30, we're going to have two more questions. Chris and Rick, so I don't know who was first, but I don't want you guys fighting. Okay. So, all right, Chris's question, then Rick's, and then we'll pray.
And like I said, if you want to come up and ask anything after that, I'll stick around. So we'll do Chris and Rick.
There is a question in here. It's as much of a comment. I spend a fair amount of time working with people who are hurting, and ways of trying to say, don't worry, get out of your imprisonment, move forward, and find some peace. One of the books that I like to reach for to that is called Breathing Underwater by Richard Rohr.
Oh, yeah.
And he uses a lot of language about ego and addiction, and our addiction to our ego. Your themes are very similar, but your language is quite different. Your story fits it, but the language of your book is different. And I was just curious whether that pull into, hey, this could be a useful book in dealing with all of our addictions, whatever form they take, whether you've sort of been kind of pulled into that at all with what you've done, or where your ministry is going with trying to deal with people in crisis versus just trying to have a general primer on how to live well.
I've thought about it a little bit, and now I'll think about it more. I have a long list I was an English major, as I told you, and I'm a lawyer, so I like words. I always have a next thing to write. And I've thought a little bit about delving actually into lawyering and addiction and speaking specifically into that profession.
Send that book to us first.
Yeah. So I think the biggest answer is only that, though. So I'll think about it more now. I always feel like I have more to write than I actually will have time. So, but it will now enter my thought cycle simply because of your question.
As a fellow Wahoo, I'd like
Wahoo-wah.
Right,
Good.
Wahoo-wah. I want to welcome you
here.
and thank you for your time. And sort of make more of a comment that I'd like you to then respond to, and that is that since I left Charlottesville, I've moved 9 times, 5 international moves too.
Oh, wow.
And so, and spent a lot of time in Asia as well. But it goes to the point you made about developing friendships. And when you move, or in the case of this lady who just lost her husband after 43 years, you're going through change.
Yes.
And it's always difficult to then find a way of reinstilling those habits because they're also born in your own, ecosystem. And when you move, you change that ecosystem.
Yes.
Where you lose a partner, your ecosystem has lost. And so I'd like you to sort of reflect a little bit, if you don't mind,
Absolutely.
on how you go about enforcing those positive habits in an environment of change.
Yes, that's a great question, and it's applicable because since 2006, I went from Charlottesville to Shanghai to DC to Richmond, and it was only recently that I lived in Richmond longer than I lived in Shanghai. So for a good, 15 years of my life outside of college, I also was relocating, and sometimes radically, right, to China and back. And I think that I am blessed and lucky in that my first move was to Shanghai because I was taught, I think, there how to live in a missionary community. So you can imagine, we all go to Shanghai, and we're kind of unique. We're like the only white people in a city of 25 million Asian people. We got to stick together. We feel like we're outcasts. We feel like we're different. Again, we feel like we're a persecuted church. And I think I learned there to find your friends, find your small group, and be vulnerable with them, because that will save you. And so when I came back to law school, that pattern, I think, had been taught me. So when we joined a church, I was looking for those kind of people that felt like they were on a mission here too, and they were willing to look for friendship. And then when we moved to Richmond, it was the same thing. And I had to think really hard about it when I moved to Richmond, because I was like, now I'm just sort of leaving a trail of friends. Does this make sense anymore? But while I think that the average American should be a little bit more careful about their geography, I think we kind of assume it's always fine to move for work. But why would you move for friendship? I kind of wish we would reverse that and be like, well, the default is I'm going to live around my family and friends because community is life-giving. But if work calls me away, if the Lord calls me away, I'll do that. I think we could use a flip. But in any case, I think the rut is the rut. Like once you practice, I'm the kind of person who looks for that kind of community. I think the beautiful thing about community is the people who look for it they don't have to search in the dark for it. They can create it. You can be the kind of person who speaks vulnerably, and creates those relationships. So I would encourage anybody in the midst of a move or after a transition to go try to stir it up. You're precisely the kind of person who might be ringing the bell that resonates with other hearts. Like, I'm so glad you started that Thursday night group because I was looking for friends too. You probably find more people than not who say that.